Dark Souls might be one of the most talked about games ever, and especially in the video essay space in this site, so I'll keep the introduction brief. While many of its strengths and weaknesses have been talked about and analyzed to death, including its difficulty, lore, hype bosses, world and level design, I feel that a specific aspect of the latter isn't talked about as much as it should be, or at least as much as I find it interesting. For my lack of a good accent, I'll rely extra on definitions to make sure I manage to get my point across. I think defining what we exactly mean by vague terms like world design and depth is important when talking about video games, since the medium is new and the terms rarely have a definitive meaning and can be taken to different places by different people. The definitions that I'll be using here are of course not any more true than anyone else's. I'll define them only that I could know that we are on the same page. World design refers to the way different independent levels or areas are connected to one another, or in general it refers to the game's level design on a macro level. In Dark Souls, when we talk about world design, we will talk about its verticality, the shortcuts, its seamless transition between levels, and the way that you can see other levels from afar. Level design refers to how the levels themselves are designed, how combat rooms are oriented, how the boss arena affects the fight itself, how the level uses shortcuts to loop back onto a single bonfire, and so on. Dark Souls is exceptional on both of these fronts, but enough people have talked about them better than I could, so the topic I'll be focusing on today is a new field of level design that I, very professionally and officially, have named Vibe Design. Vibe design refers to what the game does in order to make the level deliver a certain atmosphere or a story. It could be something as simple as the soundtrack, the enemy placement, or a color palette, but the idea is that it is used strictly in order to work towards making the player feel a certain way, the way that the level intends. A simple but effective example would be level 1-2 in Mario. After the first level, which was blandly happy, the second level takes place underground. A different designer might have used some rocks as the background and called it a day, but Miyamoto used a few extra tricks in order to really sell that semi-spooky cave vibe he was going for. Along with a spookier soundtrack, he made the level feel cramped by creating a ceiling and using a more dense layout, one that demands the player to mine his way out sometimes, while Goombas are coming in through the small gaps that are left to move. It made the cave feel all the more cavey instead of just cave-themed. Going back to Dark Souls, I will give just one example of an area that shows that it is clearly aware of its vibe and it's doing everything in its power in order to enforce it. Darkwood Garden comes in quite early, especially in first playthroughs. The vibe that Miyazaki decided to give the player here is that of getting lost in a deep forest, not knowing which way to go, which way is back and which way is forward. He did it expertly with a combination of a few tricks. The main way that we navigate through Dark Souls is through the level layout. After going through an area even once or twice, it's quite easy to memorize the layout and know which way is forward and which way is back to the bonfire. At least in all the levels that came before this one. The Undead Asylum, Undead Berg and the Undead Parish all lead you quite straightforwardly to the next objective. The forest takes this privilege away by making its layout repetitive and basic. The level is quite simple, but it consists of a few big areas that are empty from distinct paths, rooms or even elevation. Only trees and paths that look similar to one another but lead to different ways. The layout could have been confusing, but it would have been all for naught if you could just look into the distance with a simple 360 degrees flip, spot the entrance and then walk out forward. To avoid that, the forest features a thick fog that limits your vision further than 20 meters or some other number. The combination of the two creates a level that is quite easy to get lost in. If you walk around for a few minutes without keeping track of where you are, you could easily lose yourself. Luckily for the player, there are some other ways to find your way around the game, some ways that are more specific to Dark Souls. Unluckily for them, Darkwood Garden has them covered. If you've played any of the Souls game, you know that one of the most common ways to get around and give yourself some sense of direction in areas you're not fluent in yet are these idle enemies. Basically, enemies in Dark Souls usually don't spawn, they're usually already there. When you start a level, all enemies spawn all at once, and until the player gets within the notice distance, they usually just stand there, waiting. So, if you're not sure whether you have been to a section of the level, but then you see some crowd of undead fellas just hanging there, it's a clear sign that you haven't been there yet. To avoid giving the player such a free hand, the enemies in Darkwood Garden spawn a little bit differently. The main two enemies here are the Tree People and the Stone Knights. Similar to other enemies, these two also spawn all at once and then wait, but with a key difference. While an unvisited section of the Undead Berg looks like this, an unvisited section of the Darkwood Garden looks like this. The Tree People hide underground until the player gets close enough, then they barge out. And the Stone Knights start as remains on the ground, then build themselves up when the player gets close. Both enemies don't let you see them from far, so that you couldn't use this precious Dark Souls skill that you've been getting comfortable using up until now. The last way that players subconsciously find their way around Dark Souls is through items. Items drops are some of the only things in Dark Souls that don't respawn when you die or rest at a bonfire. Combine that with the fact that items are glowing stronger and brighter than most things, and are visible further than most things, and you've got a new way to find yourself around levels. Similar to enemies, seeing an item from afar can indicate that you haven't been to that section of a level. Similar to how enemies do, but this time it means that you have never been to that section of the level, and not just since resting at a bonfire, which can be less or more useful depending on what you're looking for at the moment. All around Darkwood Garden you could find these glowing flowers. Combined with the fog, when you look at them from far enough, they look just like the items. I can't get over it. They're just like one of these plants that lure bugs with colorful parts, only to devour them. When the player sees one of these in the distance, he will naturally walk towards it, happy to find a section of the level he hasn't visited yet, only to realize that it's just another flower and that now he has lost his sense of direction. The only way to realistically avoid getting lost is walking in the same direction, but even then the large areas are semicircular, which makes a straight line ineffective at clearing the area, and being able to ignore the item flowers isn't easy. The repetitive design, the fog, the underground enemies and the flowers combined make Darkwood Garden give the player the exact experience of being lost in a deep forest. Most games would have sufficed with just the trees or the fog, but Dark Souls dares going 5 steps deeper in order to really make the player feel like he is in a forest, and not just a forest level. There are quite a few more examples of this design philosophy throughout the game, but I decided to focus on just this one in order to both keep this video on the shorter side and in order to not spoil too much, so this video could also work as a recommendation for people who hesitated picking up the game and needed another reason. I'd like to make one final point before I close this one off. In my opinion, when it comes down to it, all video games are aiming for the same thing. They try to fulfill a fantasy. In some games that fantasy is obvious. I don't need to tell you what fantasy Spider-Man or the Arkham Knight games are trying to sell you, but with some others it's a little less obvious. The fantasy may be something more abstract, such as exploring a post-apocalyptic world, being fast, being faster than your enemies, leading an army, or even leading a stressful day job. Usually, when I try to judge a game, I try to avoid comparing it directly against other games, since video games as a medium feature so many more variables to the point where I think it's unfair to compare games to one another, even within the same genre. I try to instead understand what fantasy the game is trying to fulfill and sell me, and then judge the game against itself, based on how effectively it manages to fulfill that fantasy. With that style of thinking, I think vibe design is truly one of the greatest and most important aspects of Dark Souls, and one that makes it such a great and memorable game.